Hello. First of all, I would like to thank everybody for having invited me, and I'm very happy to be here in Tel Aviv and to talk about, obviously, a subject that is in my, let's say, which I have worked on, and which is dynamism in Italian art at the beginning of the century, mostly on Italian futurism. And now, obviously, I have taken inspiration from Naamah's book. Unfortunately, I have not met Naamah, but I have read the book, which has been totally enlightening for me, and especially for her exegetic studies that guided her in the interpretation of Hermann Rorschach's theories on movement. And obviously I will take, as I told you, inspiration from that particular subject. And theories that she has developed and which literally captivated me. And Naamah develops a sharp and fascinating analysis regarding application of the famous ink blots to the work of especially of two artists close to Rorschach by affinity and culture, and one is Nikolai Kulbin and the other is Ferdinand Hodler. She further wonders about what induced the scholar to reflect on Russian futurism, setting out from the fundamental discovery of a manuscript on the subject during her tenacious perusal of a great amount of archive material. So I will start by using, in fact, most of the illustrations from Naamah's fine book as a springboard to talk about Italian futurism and artistic theories of dynamism. Now here we have an image of an artist, one of the futurists, and this is Giacomo Balla, and you see him, this is quite an interesting image because you see him in front of one of his paintings. The painting is called Bankruptcy, but it's a door, a big door, which now we see also. This is the real painting, which you see all the children with the chalk have made some drawings on the door, which is closed because of bankruptcy. But you see this already how Balla really shifts the image into a completely different perspective, and here you have this oblique image giving the idea of dynamism, but which is the relation, in fact, with Rorschach. From the words of Rorschach, which were brought to light by Naamah, and I'm relating to the manuscript, which is dated 1915, if I'm not mistaken, where Rorschach talks about Russian artists. There emerges, on the one hand, an interest in the new artistic forms of Russian artists, but on the other, we note a feeling of skepticism for a style that appears to him as an ingenuous transposition of scientific laws. And here I quote Rorschach from the manuscript, which was found by Naamah. The futurist who paints movement, he paints, for example, one leg after another, and consequently experiences kinesthetically or synkinetically a kinesthetic, visual kinesthetic parallel succession. He paints successively in time, and therefore the image may leave him with an impression of succession. It appears to him to be a real movement. These are Rorschach's words. For all their interest, especially in relation to the time when they were written, those words nonetheless reflect the criticisms that were in the air. but a rereading at the distance of a century with the detachment of history allows us to approach the spirit of those artists with a different eye. And Balla's dog on a leash, the image of which Rorschach seems to have in mind, does not imply a merely analytic dimension. Balla's investigations of photography, of light, of kineticism, of the representation of movements do not lead to a simple, linear, progressive multiplication of states of motion. The idea of time is understood rather as proportion in the persistence of mutable things, rhythmic spatial succession, image of a numerical interval. In the tracks of a thought still rooted, though, in an instinctive way, in the becoming of nature, rooted in the thought of a cyclicality measurable in mathematical quantities, translatable onto canvas in well-defined forms and rhythms, where light is perceived both as physical entity and as the immutable truth of a cosmogony charged with mystery. Thus, the study of light refractions, isolated in the structure of the rigidly two-dimensional plane, is an inquiry into the decomposition of color, but also a parameter of an eternal dimension. Balla creates the point of force that balances the two tensions, and the lines of the painting, horizontal, vertical, sinusoidal, acts by impulse due to these movements that intersect without any conflict. This is why, even in the compositions most aimed at formal reduction, the sense of reality is not denied, nor is the idea of nature and cosmic temporality erased. The image becomes isolated and infinitesimal fragment of a mobile universe, visible translation of a concept linked to objectification of the cognitive act. A synthesis, therefore, to be interpreted not as reduction, but rather as trace of a passage played on the pauses and on the succession of bodies or objects, disunited to the extent of losing themselves in the glow of light, in a stylistic dynamism that is fruit of a singular mystical sensibility. Boccioni's interpretation is more materialistic, seeing in dynamism, and here I quote Boccioni, seeing in dynamism the lyrical conception of forms interpreted in the infinite manifestation of their relativity between absolute motion and relative motion, between environment and object, which come together to form the appearance of a whole, environment plus object. It is the creation of a new form which expresses the relativity between weight and expansion, between motion of rotation and motion of revolution. Here, in fact, is life itself grasped in a form which life creates in its infinite succession. It seems clear to me, this is still Boccioni talking, that this succession is not to be grasped in the repetition of legs, arms, and faces, as many have stupidly supposed, but is achieved through the intuitive search for the one single form which gives continuity in space. And this is the end of quotation. In the furious search for a theoretic position within the artistic avant-gardes, the impassioned words of Boccioni, the most intellectual of the group, are an attempt to transfer into a speculative context the figurative experiments that rapidly followed upon his 1910 meeting with Marinetti. It's hard to trace the sources of his interpretations and the laws from which he deduces axioms for an actual architecture of futurist thought. There is no question, however, about the powerful impact of the ideas of modern physics on the creative imagination of a whole generation of artists, the revolutionary and overwhelming change of viewpoint which extended the field of experience to the incorporeal and abstract territories of the mind. The idea of a temporal simultaneity transferred to the observer's perception and logic system, which opens up to the sphere of intuition. Time and space died yesterday, as Filippo Tommaso Marinetti declared in emphatic tones at the end of his manifesto of February 1909. His impassionate interpretation of science, seen in a new dimension, largely unknown and unexplored, became a presupposition for his future disciples in the construction of a new aesthetic vision through speed and dynamism. Fascinating concepts which invite participation more than plain observation, which call for total involvement of the artist in the corporeity of the gesture, and at the same time for mental projection into the abysses of the imperceptible. Space no longer exists. These are the words of the futurists. A street soaked by rain and lit by electric lamps plunges into the center of the earth. The sun is thousands of miles from us, yet doesn't the house in front of us perhaps seem to be set into the solar disk? And the 16 people around you in a moving tram are 1, 10, 4, 3. They are motionless and they move. They come and go, are reflected in the street, swallowed up by a zone of sunlight, thence return to sit down, persistent symbols of universal vibration. The construction of pictures is stupidly traditional. Painters have always shown us things and people placed before us. We will put the spectator in the center of the picture. End of quote. Words that became famous at the time for a new figure of eccentricity, for semantics based on paradox. Yet, that colorful and vivacious language, mirror of a prolific and highly accelerated imagination, contains a logic close to the hypothesis of a science no longer referable to axioms, an effect of the interest in and lively debate about the first theoretical formulations by Albert Einstein, which in 1905 had revolutionized received ideas on the nature of the universe. Not by means of cold empirical exposition of data, but in the desire to know and interpret the objective phenomena of reality. Excluding the idea of empty space, Einstein posited that of a space that interacts with matter. But if his discovery overturned the way of conceiving space and time, other inventions had incredible reverberations on the culture of the age. And we just saw the discovery of X-rays by Röntgen, research into electromagnetic and radio waves, the radioactivity of uranium by Becquerel, studies of the atom and its composition by Rutherford, or again those on energy by Max Planck. A profound change which dictated the very manner of rethinking reality. As in all fields of human thought, declared the young futurist painters, the immobile obscurities of dogma have been replaced by enlightened individual research. So our art, So in our art, we need to substitute academic tradition with a vivifying current of individual freedom. We want to get back into life. In negating its past, today's science must respond to the intellectual needs of our times. So if Boccioni already in his youthful writings, I'm talking of his diaries of 1907, had already expressed the need to paint the new, to reproduce contemporaneity, the words of Marinetti represented the collision force and the original and energetic hookup for a multidimensional world. In an intuitive and certainly spontaneous manner, opposition to the past was delineated with a pantheistic impulse and a still romantic sensibility. And it was the difficulty in conjugating the old syntax with the new logic that enfeebled the power of images, which, on first appearance, were received as pure transposition of a theoretic hypothesis that was hard to represent, just as we just heard through Rorschach's words. The states of mind, this is one of the paintings by Boccioni, one of the three paintings by Boccioni. This is the ones who go. The states of mind, the paintings that we'll see in a moment, the street enters the house and simultaneous visions, and subsequently the dynamisms between painting and sculpture, depict three moments and three different scansions of what Boccioni identified as expression of dynamism in potential, as propulsive force of an idea of movement, not as representation of a movement then, but as essence of an immaterial physical factor, inexpressible if not by means other than traditional ones. And here I quote a phrase by Boccioni, which belongs to a conference which was given by Boccioni in 1911. A time will come when the picture will no longer be enough. Its immobility will be an archaism with the vertiginous movement of human life. The eye of man will perceive colors as feelings within themselves. Multiplied colors will not need form to be understood, and paintings will be swirling musical composition of great colored gases, which, on the scene of a free horizon, will move and electrify the complex soul of a crowd that we cannot yet conceive of. Prefiguring what would come to pass half a century later, Boccioni got into step with the speed of scientific contributions, with what he was able to deduce from the frenetic succession of epoch-making changes. In the first attempt at harmonizing dynamism and the rigidity of the support lay in the logic of human sentiments, of emotions and their echo on the outside. Hence, the formal schematism of the swirling lines that we see here in the farewell, the diagonals in the ones who go, and the verticals of the states of mind, almost a diagram, a synthesis of the statistical possibilities of measuring through traces and colors the extension of a still collective ego. And here again I quote the futurists, and why did they laugh when we Italians in this country, still covered in ruins and populated by aesthetic mummies, denied the opacity of bodies, the multiplication of images, the interpenetration of bodies, the dislocation of details, the supreme needs to make the spectator the center of the picture. End of quote. If one proceeds by abstract truth in the scientific field, the theory of relativity has clearly indicated it, while reinforcing the individual presupposition with regard to previous knowledge. Why not imagine a knot made of gaseous emissions in the synesthetic reality of a single intuition? But the limitation is still the canvas, and the conflict remains in its static opposition. Illusory diaphragm between the vastness of the physical universe and the fixed vision of the image, in relationship to the physical magnitudes with which the body is still is obliged to compare itself. Hence, the choice of subjects which have nothing to do with the marvelous mechanical contraptions of the contemporary era, neither automobiles nor aeroplanes, but only old locomotives, puffing and titanic horses in the spiral rolling of their kinetic tension. Modernism clashes with the past, but cannot ignore the human yardstick. So, if the Cubists, in particular Picasso in his years of analytic exploration, decomposed and dismantled systems and genres of painting from within, the futurist still remained bound to an intimate logic of nature. The first experiment of states of mind was followed by a stylistically more complex attempt. The phase of emotional waves, of involvement of the senses in a cubistic grid structure, as we saw in the states of mind, underwent a sudden jolt. Not a metamorphosis, but rather a subdivision of groupings in antithesis with the surface of the support. In the states of mind, the dynamic, chromatic, and linear flow is symbolically aligned with the meaning of the emotive suggestions in the moments that precede and follow detachment in the crowded concreteness of a railway station. In The Street Enters the House, which is this painting, and in Simultaneous Visions, the perspective undergoes a lightning-swift overturning, as if by the reflection of several spatialities in a sophisticated play of mirrors. It is the awareness of a fourth dimension. Fundamental here are Hermann von Helmholtz's studies reprised by Einstein, that surfaces imperiously a further step in the development process of the dynamic concept. One, in the previous image, two heads at the center of the visual structure are now the fulcrum of a rotating cubic construction that encloses a new dimension, that of time, a multifaceted device through which Boccioni experiments with the possibility of showing simultaneously, in one image only, the forms of the external environment interwoven with the temporal extension of interior reality. So it's the same face mirrored and showing both realities. By creating a tetraspace and setting all the elements of representation along the segments of the geometrical construct, the lines of force of the two paintings converge at the point in which perception and psychic states of consciousness merge in one single outward appearance. It is therefore in the projection of the glance that the movement of mnestic processes materializes, revealing in the reverberation of the face the obscure part of emotions and recollections in the vertiginous whirling of a space-time duration. Just as the general plans of energy in the pictorial field tend to unify urban chaos and swarming work activities with the figures who observes and blocks that scene, in Boccioni's writings one notes an attempt to bring literary, philosophical, and scientific insights into line with a single semantic system. That chaotic interlocking of fragments in sharp bunches is in keeping with the infinite stimuli that open up to every form of awareness and hark back to the inseparability of consciousness and psyche, to an interaction between the universe of mind and matter. In the third phase, the paradigmatic schematism loses its exemplificative sign, and in the 1913 works, to different extents, the theme of movement at last encounters the synthesis of dynamic continuity in accordance with the general law of simultaneity and interpenetration which governs everything that in movement is appearance, exception, or subtlety. The projection of the cube are multiplied on the two-dimensional surface. The luminous bunches intersect with the volumetric shifting of forms projected into a free space, no longer cadenced by realistic elements or concrete places. In the crystallization of luminous and chromatic vibrations, the system of an artistic concept is consolidated, and the masses thrust into space in relation to the interior tension of the object, in accordance with the potential inherent to its state of motion, which Boccioni calls primordial psychology, coupled with absolute motion. Motion which is raised, in the artist's intention, to the category of spirit. The force lines of what is depicted constitute the framework of a space in becoming. Giving body to the lines and not to the outlines, Boccioni hints at the potentialities innate in the object's force of appearance and at the presuppositions of variability in relation to what surrounds it. In this way, the object continues to live in its reality, subject to the tensions, tractions, and resistances thereof, but at the same time it refers its own individual ones back to the surrounding space, giving rise to an exchange of dynamic impulses. In the rhythms of fullness and emptiness on which the planes of the object and its environment interweave and interpenetrate, energy thickens in the center, in the grouping of gravity from which the forces are freed that propagate in the atmosphere. They are plastic images and concepts, like the sculpture, unique forms of continuity in space, derived from courageous premises and living motivations. Images that arose in that precise historical moment in the wake of what was in the air. And here, well, we know all these are very well-known images. The one on top are by Marais, on the bottom by Muybridge, obviously, and from Henri Bergson's philosophical theories on vitalism to the epistemological studies of Henri Poincaré, from scientific investigation to the spread of interest in the phenomena and doctrines of the paranormal and spiritualism, right down to the astonishing repercussions in the field of literature. And, well, on top we have the very well-known image of Méliès, the beginning of the century film, and all these publications, Verne and this book by Abbott, which is Flatland, at the beginning of the century. Imagination overtook the idea of reality, but if abstractionism was thinkable with word and sound, in painting the limitations of the support and of perception were increasingly posited as a barrier of impalpable and airy echoes. So how to stand against the natural paratactic disposition dictated by pure physical experience? If experimentation drew the futurists towards the threshold of the impossible, and with them those Russian artists, this is Malevich obviously, to whom Rorschach dedicated his extensive treatise, contemporaneously the theme of a succession of movements in space captivated Marcel Duchamp, who, moreover, was a great admirer of Balla's work. But Duchamp would come to resolve this conflict only by liberating himself from that immobile field, from the fixity of the support. Shifting his research from the surface of the canvas, from the 1912 nude descending a staircase, he would succeed with an apparently Dadaist gesture in concretizing dynamic representation in a tangible object closely bound to the very idea of movement. The instantaneous repose vision of the 1913 bicycle wheel contains the idea of demultiplication of a form consisting of multiple spokes. But in that logic is contained also the idea of a set in n+1 dimensions. And if the thickness of the wheel conceptually restores the structure of the picture, of the idea, let's say, of picture, the dynamic unit is founded on the idea of frequency. In the succession of motion, the spokes at speed are no longer perceptible, and the circular area becomes a compact one, where the lines of the spoke itself seems to be found simultaneously on all points of the circumference. The artifice of painting was now subdued, defeated by an object that simulates its own self-same artifice. Thank you.